Ha-joon sets down his glass. Not because he's finished. Because something is wrong. The wine was a Grenache, dry, familiar, the kind he orders when he wants to feel like a person who has his life together. He's had half a glass. Maybe less. But the candlelight is doing something it shouldn't. Bending at the edges, softening the sharp corners of the restaurant into something warm and imprecise. His hands feel like they belong to someone standing slightly behind him. This isn't the wine. The thought arrives quietly, clinically, like a notification he doesn't want to open. He looks at Taemin across the table. Taemin is smiling. Ha-joon had chosen sable and silk specifically for the lighting. That's the kind of person he is. Someone who researches a restaurant's ambience before confirming a reservation, who arrives 7 minutes early, who orders the doenjang jjigae with black truffle because it is the only fusion on the menu that doesn't feel like an apology. He is precise. He is careful. He is the kind of man who notices when candlelight bends wrong. He had agreed to this date because his best friend Park Soo-bin had said, "Ha-joon, you work, you eat alone, you sleep. You are 28 years old, and you are already haunting yourself." So here he is, haunting a restaurant instead. Kwon Tae-min had been everything the dating profile promised. Warm eyes, easy laugh, a jaw that looked architecturally considered. He'd asked Ha-joon about his work with what felt like genuine curiosity. He'd refilled the wine glass exactly once, with both hands, like someone raised with manners. Ha-joon had thought, maybe Soo-bin was right. He was not right. Because now the room is tilting on a very slow axis and Taemin's smile has stopped reaching his eyes, and Ha-joon's body is sending signals that his mind is only just beginning to translate. 3 floors above the main dining room, in a surveillance suite that doesn't appear on any building schematic, Choi Seung-jae has not moved in 41 seconds. He is watching monitor 4. Table 9. Corner booth. Soft lighting. His lighting in his restaurant, the restaurant he built so that people like Ha-joon could sit somewhere beautiful and feel, for one evening, completely safe. His lieutenant, Nam Jae-seo, follows his gaze to the screen. Reads the stillness in Seung-jae's shoulders the way you read weather. Should I send security? Seung-jae doesn't answer. He is already reaching for his jacket. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. Taemin reached across the table and covered Ha-joon's hand with his own. It was a beautiful gesture. Tender, even. The kind of thing you'd do if you were worried about someone you cared about. A slow, deliberate pressure, thumb moving in small circles over Ha-joon's knuckles. Anyone watching from another table would have seen a devoted date, noticing that something was wrong. Ha-joon noticed the thumb. Noticed the circles. His mind filed it carefully, the way it filed everything, the detail sitting bright and sharp against the growing fog. He practiced that some quiet part of him thought. He practiced exactly how that should look. "Hey!" Taemin's voice dropped to something soft and private. "You okay?" You went pale all of a sudden. Ha-joon opened his mouth. What came out was, "I'm fine." Automatic. Trained. The response of a man who had spent a lifetime not wanting to be an inconvenience. "You don't look fine." Taemin was already signaling for the bill with his other hand. A discreet 2-finger lift, barely a gesture. Prearranged, Ha-joon realized distantly. The waiter was already moving. "I think the wine hit you harder than expected. Fresh air will help." The wine. Ha-joon looked at his glass. Still more than half full. He was certain of that. He was a precise person. He measured things. "I don't think it was the wine," he said. Taemin smiled at him. "You've been working too hard. You said so yourself, 3 commissions, no breaks. Your body is just telling you to slow down." He stood, buttoning his jacket with the calm efficiency of a man who had somewhere to be and knew exactly how to get there. "Come on. Let me take you outside." Ha-joon did not stand. His legs weren't cooperating fully, that was new. That had happened somewhere in the last 4 minutes, without his permission. He pressed his palm flat against the table. The linen was expensive. He focused on that. The thread count. The slight resistance under his fingers. "Stay here," he told himself. "Stay in your body." Ha-joon. Taemin came around the table and crouched beside his chair. Eye level, voice gentle, expression arranged into something that would photograph as concern. "Let me help you up." "Okay. We're just going to get some air. I'd like some water first." A beat. Something moved through Taemin's eyes. Not anger, not exactly. More like a recalculation. The smile didn't waver. "Of course. But outside will be better, I promise. The bathroom downstairs has better lighting if you need a moment." I said I'd like water. Ha-joon heard his own voice from a slight distance. Still level. Still precise. He was proud of that, in a dim, faraway way. Please. Taemin studied him for exactly 2 seconds. Then he stood, smoothed his lapel, and signaled the waiter again. When the water arrived, Ha-joon lifted the glass with both hands, because one hand alone wasn't reliable anymore, and drank it slowly. Methodically. Buying time for a reason he couldn't fully articulate, except that some animal part of him understood that leaving through that door with Taemin was the wrong move. Better? Taemin asked. Getting there. Ha-joon set the glass down. Sit with me a moment. Ha-joon. Just a moment. He met Taemin's eyes. Held them. He watched the calculation happen again behind that warm, practiced gaze. The cost-benefit of pushing versus waiting, of a scene versus a smooth exit. Taemin was performing patience, but it had a structure to it. A timeline. Ha-joon was disrupting it, and the disruption was showing very slightly at the corners of his mouth. Taemin sat. He picked up his phone, checking something or pretending to, and Ha-joon used the 30 seconds to take inventory. His hands, unreliable. His legs, present but distant, like a phone call with bad signal. His vision, soft at the periphery, sharpest in a narrow band directly ahead. His mind, still his. Still working. Slower than usual, but his. Someone put something in my drink, he thought, with the calm of a man reading a diagnosis he had already suspected. This is a medical situation. I need to not leave this building with this person. The problem was that he wasn't sure he could stand without help. The larger problem was that the only person offering help was the one who had done this to him. I need to use the restroom, Ha-joon said. Taemin looked up from his phone. I'll walk you. I can manage. I don't think you can. And there it was. Not concern. Certainty. The voice of someone who knew exactly what was in Ha-joon's bloodstream and had timed this carefully and was now gently, reasonably, helpfully running out of patience. Ha-joon placed both hands on the table and pushed himself to standing. The room tilted once, a long, slow roll, and then settled into something he could work with. Taemin rose immediately, one hand at Ha-joon's elbow, the other at the small of his back. Steering. The touch of someone guiding a parcel. There we go, Taemin said quietly. Just lean on me. They moved through the restaurant. Ha-joon concentrated on the floor, dark herringbone tile, expensive and even, a floor he would have noted in his sketchbook on any other evening. He counted his steps. He felt the eyes of other diners slide over them, a couple leaving, one of them unwell, nothing unusual, nothing to see, and understood that this was the entire point, that they looked exactly like what Taemin needed them to look like. They were nearly at the entrance when Ha-joon's legs simply stopped. Not dramatically. Not a collapse. Just a refusal. A quiet mutiny below the knee. He gripped the back of a vacant chair. The wood was solid under his hand. Real. Ha-joon. Taemin's voice was still soft, but the warmth had thinned. We're almost outside. I need to sit down. Outside. I need to sit down now. He lowered himself into the vacant chair. His heart was beating strangely. Not fast, just irregular, skipping in a way that felt editorial, like it was trying to tell him something important. The restaurant continued around him. Soft jazz from somewhere. The smell of braised short rib and sesame and warm bread. Taemin crouched in front of him again. This time the concern on his face had a different quality. Thinner. More urgent. Listen to me, he said, very quietly. You need to come with me right now. This is going to get worse before it gets better, and you don't want it to get worse here. Do you understand? Ha-joon looked at him. Who hired you? He asked. Taemin's expression went completely still. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. The jazz played. Someone laughed at a nearby table. The candle between them threw light upward, catching the sharp new blankness in Taemin's eyes. Then Taemin smiled, smaller now, private, the performance finally dropping, and leaned forward. That, he said softly, is a very unfortunate question. Ha-joon's grip tightened on the chair. His vision was narrowing at the edges, the restaurant folding gently inward. He held the center. He held on. He did not hear the elevator open behind them. He did not see the room go quiet in that particular way a room does when something with real authority enters it. But Taemin did. Ha-joon watched him look up. Watched the color leave his face in one clean, efficient motion, the way water drains. And then a voice said, from somewhere just behind Ha-joon's left shoulder, very calm, very quiet, like a door closing in an empty house. Move your hand. 43 minutes before Taemin reached for Ha-joon's elbow, Choi Seung-jae had been reviewing acquisition documents. The surveillance suite occupied the entire east side of Sable and Silk's third floor, a long, climate-controlled room that didn't exist on the building's registered floor plan. 12 monitors. 1 desk. 2 chairs, though Seung-jae had never used the second one. The room smelled like cold air and expensive coffee, and the particular silence of a space that had been soundproofed with serious money. Nam Jae-seo stood at the far monitor, scrolling through the evening's reservation manifest. Table 12 confirmed for 11 o'clock. The Busan delegation. He paused. They want the private dining room. They always want the private dining room, Seung-jae said, without looking up. They're also asking whether the chef can accommodate a no-garlic restriction for the senior delegate. Tell the chef. I already told the chef. The chef wanted to know if you'd be joining. I won't. Jae-seo made a note. The room returned to its expensive silence. Seung-jae signed the bottom of the acquisition document and set it aside. He reached for his coffee. Cold. He drank it anyway, eyes moving on instinct to monitor 4, the wide-angle feed covering the main dining room's south corner, tables 7 through 11. He had installed that particular camera at a slightly lower angle than the others. He knew why. He hadn't told Jae-seo. Table 9. Corner booth. The Omega was already seated. He came in on Thursdays. Had done for 6 weeks now. Always alone, always the corner booth, always the same order. Doenjang jjigae with the black truffle modification, a glass of the Grenache, sparkling water on the side. He stayed exactly 90 minutes. He drew in a small sketchbook while he waited for his food, and he ate slowly, and he looked at the room the way an architect looks at a room. Not as a backdrop, but as a subject. Like he was reading it. Seung-jae had watched him do this for 6 weeks and had not once gone downstairs. Tonight, there was someone across the table from him. New guest at table 9, Jae-seo said from across the room. Observational. Neutral. I see him. First time. Not a regular. Jae-seo pulled up the reservation. Kwon Tae-min, booked 4 days ago. Paid the reservation deposit in cash through a third-party concierge. A pause. That's an unusual payment method for a dinner date. Seung-jae said nothing. He was watching Tae-min refill Ha-joon's glass. Both hands on the bottle. Mannered. Correct. His eyes on Ha-joon's face the entire time. Warm, attentive, performing interest with the disciplined consistency of someone who had trained for it. He's good, Seung-jae thought. Whatever he is, he's good at it. Run him, he said. Jae-seo was already typing. Running. On monitor 4, Ha-joon laughed at something Tae-min said. A small, surprised laugh, the kind that happens before you can decide whether to allow it. He touched the stem of his wine glass. Looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. There was something careful about the way he held himself even in laughter, like a person who had learned to keep one hand on the door. Seung-jae watched that and felt something he had no useful name for. Kwon Tae-min, Jae-seo said. 34. Listed occupation is private security consulting. No fixed employer for the past 3 years, freelance contracts, mostly short-term. He scrolled. 2 prior aliases. 1 flag from Incheon Transit Authority, 18 months ago. A person matching his description was questioned in connection with an incident involving an incapacitated passenger. Charges not filed. He stopped scrolling. He's a contractor. For whom? Unknown. The flag is isolated, no faction signature on record. On monitor 4, Tae-min's hand moved below the table line for 4 seconds. His expression didn't change. His eyes stayed on Ha-joon's face, warm and steady and utterly practiced. Ha-joon picked up his wine glass. Seung-jae stood up. The treaty, Jae-seo said immediately. Not a question. Not a protest. Just a marker. Placing the fact in the room where Seung-jae could see it clearly before he moved past it. The neutral ground doctrine. Sable and Silk existed in a declared neutral zone, a designation that had taken 2 years and considerable negotiation to establish. It meant no faction business conducted on premises. It meant no intervention in external disputes. It meant that what happened between 2 civilians at Table 9, regardless of what it was not Seung-jae's jurisdiction. I know what the treaty says, Seung-jae said. The council will have questions. Let them. Seung-jae. Jae-seo's voice was quiet, measured. The voice of a man who had worked beside him for 11 years and had earned the right to speak plainly. If this guest has a faction connection we haven't identified yet, Intervening could be interpreted as a declaration. You'd be handing Baek Ju-won a legitimate grievance. On monitor 4, Ha-joon set down his glass. Something changed in his posture, subtle, a millimeter of stillness entering his shoulders. He was noticing. Whatever was in that glass, it was moving fast, and some precise, careful part of him was already beginning to read the situation. He knows something is wrong, Seung-jae thought. He's holding on. He comes here every Thursday, Seung-jae said. Jae-seo was quiet. He orders the same thing. He sits in the same booth. He draws in that sketchbook until the food arrives, and then he puts it away because he thinks it's impolite to draw while eating. Seung-jae picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He tipped the Thursday server 40% on a mid-range bill for 3 weeks in a row because she told him once that Thursdays were slow. He shrugged the jacket on. He comes to my restaurant. He sits under my lights. He is not a faction problem, Jae-seo. He is a person. Jae-seo looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of a thing he had quietly suspected for some weeks. And if the council asks why you intervened? Seung-jae straightened his cuff. On the monitor, Tae-min was rising from his seat, hand extending toward Ha-joon's elbow, the whole performance tilting now toward extraction. Tell them the restaurant has a policy, Seung-jae said, against guests being poisoned at the table. He moved to the private elevator at the room's north wall. Press the call button. The doors opened immediately. It was always ready, because he had designed this building, and he had designed it to be ready. I'll have the car brought around, Jae-seo said behind him. And I'll call Dr. Shin. Seung-jae stepped inside. And Seung-jae. Jae-seo's voice caught the elevator doors just before they closed. Try not to break anything in the dining room. The doors shut. The elevator began to descend. On the monitor, Jae-seo now watched alone. Choi Seung-jae's corner booth remained empty. Acquisition documents signed and stacked and utterly forgotten. Coffee gone cold beside them. The elevator opened behind the host station, behind a panel that looked like lacquered wall and was, to anyone who hadn't built it, simply lacquered wall. Seung-jae stepped out without hurry. The dining room received him the way rooms always received him. A ripple, moving outward from his entrance like something dropped into still water. It wasn't loud. It was never loud. A server adjusted course without knowing why. A sommelier straightened. 2 men at the bar, who had the particular stillness of people paid to have it, clocked him immediately and went very carefully back to their drinks. Seung-jae walked toward table 9. He didn't walk fast. Speed would have made it a scene, and he had no interest in scenes. He walked at the pace of a man who owned the floor beneath his feet, which he did, and who had already decided how this would end, which he had. He saw Ha-joon first. Sitting in the chair he'd pulled himself back into, both hands gripping the armrests, jaw set with the focused effort of someone trying to remain vertical through determination alone. His eyes were glassy but present, still tracking, that precise, careful mind still running, even as the body underneath it quietly failed. Then he saw Tae-min crouch forward and say something low, and watched Ha-joon's expression tighten in response. Not fear exactly. Something more controlled than fear. Recognition. Seung-jae arrived at the table and stopped. He didn't speak immediately. He stood at the edge of the booth and let the silence do its work, the way silence always did when it had enough weight behind it. Tae-min looked up. The color left his face. Move your hand, Seung-jae said. Tae-min's hand was still at Ha-joon's elbow. It dropped. Immediately, reflexively, the way a hand drops when the nervous system overrides the plan. Ha-joon turned his head slowly toward the voice. His eyes found Seung-jae and stayed there, steady despite everything, with the focus of a man using his last reliable resource. Seung-jae didn't look at him yet. He pulled out the chair across from Tae-min and sat down. Unhurried. He rested one hand flat on the table and regarded Tae-min with the patient, clinical attention of someone identifying a particular type of problem. You're going to want to sit, he said. Tae-min sat. His body made the decision before his mind agreed to it. I don't want any trouble, Tae-min said. His voice had shed its warmth entirely. What remained was flat, professional, the voice underneath the performance. This doesn't involve the pact. This is a private contract. You're in my restaurant. Neutral ground. Neutral ground, Seung-jae agreed pleasantly, means I don't conduct business here. It does not mean I watch someone be poisoned at my table and consider it a private matter. He tilted his head slightly. Who is the contract with? Tae-min's jaw tightened. I'm not going to tell you that. That's fine. Seung-jae reached into his jacket pocket and set his phone on the table, screen up. A single contact was open. Taemin looked at it. Something moved through his face, a rapid private calculation, the math of consequences arriving all at once. You can tell me here, or you can tell GISCO in a less comfortable room. The second option takes significantly longer. A long pause. The jazz played. Someone at a nearby table ordered dessert. Baekju won, Taemin said quietly. Seung-jae absorbed this without visible reaction. He picked up his phone, put it back in his pocket, and stood. He buttoned his jacket with the same measured calm he'd carried through the entire conversation. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to stand up, walk through the front door, and not stop walking. You're going to contact whoever is waiting outside and tell them the pickup isn't happening. And then you're going to make yourself very difficult to find for a very long time. He paused. Not if you understand. Taemin nodded. Good. Seung-jae glanced toward the bar. One of the two still men was already moving, drifting toward the entrance with the casual purpose of someone heading for a coat check. An escort, invisible to everyone else in the room. Go. Taemin went. Seung-jae watched him until he cleared the front door. Then he turned and crouched beside Ha-joon's chair, bringing himself to eye level, and looked at him properly for the first time. Ha-joon looked back. His grip on the armrests hadn't loosened. There were faint shadows of effort around his eyes. The look of someone who had been fighting to stay conscious through an act of pure will. Ha-joon SSI, Seung-jae said, quietly enough that it existed only between them. I'm going to take you somewhere safe. Do you understand? I understood everything, Ha-joon said. His voice was slower than usual, but precise. The whole conversation. I heard it. Something shifted in Seung-jae's chest, small and unfamiliar. I know, he said. I could tell. Baekju won. Ha-joon's eyes stayed on his. I don't know who that is. I do. We'll talk about it later. Seung-jae stood and shrugged off his jacket. He settled it across Ha-joon's shoulders without asking, the dark fabric swallowing him slightly. Ha-joon was lean, fine-boned in the way of someone who forgot to eat when he was working. Can you stand if I help you? I can try. That's enough. He got an arm around Ha-joon's back, and Ha-joon got one arm across his shoulders, and they stood together, not gracefully but completely. Ha-joon's weight leaned into him, and Seung-jae took it without adjustment, without comment, like it was simply a thing that was happening and he had already decided to be equal to it. They moved through the restaurant, but not toward the front. Seung-jae steered them left, past the service corridor, through the door that staff used and guests never saw. The kitchen opened around them, hot and bright and loud, the controlled chaos of a full dinner service, and every person in it found somewhere else to look the moment Seung-jae came through the door. Careful, Seung-jae said, at a slight step down near the back prep station. I see it, Ha-joon said. They moved through the kitchen and out through the loading bay, where the night air arrived cold and immediate. A black car was already waiting, engine running. GISCO stood beside the rear door, holding it open, expression carrying the specific neutrality of a man who had many questions and had decided all of them could wait. Seung-jae helped Ha-joon into the back seat. Ha-joon sank into the leather and exhaled. A long, slow release, the sound of a person finally allowing their body to acknowledge what had been happening to it. Seung-jae got in beside him. The door closed. The car moved. In the silence of the back seat, Ha-joon turned his head against the headrest and looked at him. The jacket was still around his shoulders. He hadn't let it slip. You knew my name, he said. Seung-jae kept his eyes on the road ahead. Yes. A pause. How long have you been watching me? A longer pause. Long enough, Seung-jae said. To know you tip well on Thursdays. Ha-joon closed his eyes. Somewhere under the fog of the drug and the cold and the aftermath of held-together terror, something almost like a quiet laugh moved through him. Then sleep took him. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. The first thing Ha-joon noticed was the ceiling. It was high, genuinely high, not the performed height of a hotel room trying to suggest luxury, but the real architectural kind that came from a building designed with intention. The material was pale concrete with a single inset beam running east to west, clean and structural and honest. A person who knew nothing about buildings might have found it cold. Ha-joon found it immediately legible, the way a familiar language is legible even when you're not quite awake. He lay still and let his eyes move around the room. White linen, dense and pressed, tucked with the precision of someone who cared about such things. A nightstand in dark walnut, bare except for a glass of water and a small folded card he couldn't read from this angle. Curtains drawn against a darkness that suggested very late or very early, the ambiguous hours. Somewhere beneath the room's curated quiet, the distant suggestion of a city that never fully slept. Cedar. The room smelled like cedar and something faintly mineral, like stone after rain. His head ached with a focused, specific quality. Not the diffuse throb of too much wine, but something more targeted, chemical, a headache that knew exactly what it was and why it was there. His hands, when he lifted them, responded correctly. That was something. He was wearing clothes that weren't his. A gray cotton shirt, well worn, too wide in the shoulders. Soft trousers. Someone had changed him into these, and he had no memory of it, and that should have frightened him more than it did. He filed it carefully, another detail to process when he had more resources. "You're awake." A voice from his left, unhurried, clinically warm. Ha-joon turned his head. A man in his 50s sat in a chair beside the bed, slight build, silver-streaked hair, the kind of steady hands that announced their profession before the rest of him did. He was closing a blood pressure cuff and setting it aside with practiced efficiency. "I'm Dr. Shin," he said. "How is your vision?" "Clear." Ha-joon tested the word. It was accurate. Better than before. "Good. The compound has largely metabolized. You were given flunitrazepam, a fast-acting variant, higher concentration than the standard formulation. Whoever prepared it knew what they were doing." He said this with the neutral precision of a man reporting weather, making no editorial of it. "Your vitals are normal. You'll have the headache for several more hours. The water on the stand has electrolytes dissolved in it. Drink all of it when you feel ready." "Thank you," Ha-joon said. Dr. Shin nodded, snapped his bag shut and stood. He moved toward the door with the quiet efficiency of someone operating on professional terms only, crossing no line he hadn't been contracted to cross. Ha-joon pushed himself upright against the headboard. The room adjusted around the movement. One slow tilt, then settled. He looked toward the window. Seung-jae was standing there. He had his back to the room, both hands clasped behind him, looking out at a skyline that Ha-joon's architectural instincts immediately placed somewhere in central Seoul. The particular arrangement of light and elevation only Gangnam produced at this hour. He was still in his dress shirt from the restaurant, jacket gone, sleeves rolled to the forearm. He hadn't moved when Ha-joon spoke. He didn't move now. Dr. Shin passed him on the way out and exchanged a look that carried an entire conversation in a single second. Then the door closed, and they were alone. Ha-joon looked at the back of Seung-jae's head. At the set of his shoulders, still but not relaxed. The stillness of someone standing in a position they chose because they were thinking and didn't want the thinking interrupted. "You can turn around," Ha-joon said. Seung-jae turned around. In the restaurant, in the low amber light, Ha-joon had registered an impression, authority, height, the particular gravity of someone who had never needed to raise their voice. In the clean light of this room, he had more information. Sharp jaw, darker eyes than he'd expected, a face that was not handsome in the easy way Taemin had been handsome, but structured. Deliberate. The kind of face that had been somewhere and returned from it. He looked at Ha-joon the way he'd looked at him in the restaurant. Direct, without performance, measuring something that wasn't size or threat. "You're safe," he said. Ha-joon considered the words. Not the content, he believed them, which was its own strange data point, but the delivery. No preamble. No explanation. No apology for the circumstances that had made the reassurance necessary. Just the fact stated plainly, offered and left standing. "I know," Ha-joon said. "I think I knew in the car." He reached for the water glass. Drank half of it, methodically as instructed. Set it down. "That's what's strange. I woke up in an unfamiliar room in someone else's clothes, and my first thought was, I'm fine. I should be more alarmed by that. You have good instincts. I have terrible instincts. I went on a date with a professional kidnapper." Seung-jae moved from the window, crossing the room and stopping at a reasonable distance. Not close, not removed. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at Ha-joon with an expression that might, in a more yielding face, have been something like concern. "He was very convincing," Seung-jae said. "He's done this before." "How many times?" "We're finding out." Ha-joon nodded slowly, tucking that into the growing file of things to process later. He looked around the room again, the ceiling, the walnut nightstand, the curtains. The considered, unhurried quality of everything in it. "This is your home," he said. "Not a question. The upper floors." Yes. And sable and silk is yours. Yes. You've seen me there before tonight. He looked at Seung-jae directly. Not just tonight. A pause. Seung-jae didn't look away. Yes. Ha-joon absorbed that. Most people, presented with that admission, would have offered something to soften it. Context, justification, a deflection. Seung-jae offered nothing. He simply held the honesty of it and waited, with the patience of a man who had learned that explaining himself too quickly was its own kind of weakness. Ha-joon found, to his mild surprise, that he respected it. "The man from the restaurant," he said. "Tae-min." He said a name before you sent him away. Baek-ju-won. He watched Seung-jae's face carefully. "You recognized it immediately. You didn't react, but I was watching your hands." A pause. Your left hand moved. Something shifted in Seung-jae's expression. Infinitesimal, a fraction of adjustment. He looked at Ha-joon the way a person looks at something they hadn't fully anticipated. "You were barely conscious," he said. "I told you. I heard everything." Ha-joon finished the water and set the glass back down on the walnut stand, precisely centered. "I'm an architectural illustrator. I notice things that don't add up. I notice when a wall is in the wrong place. I notice when a hand moves." He looked at the folded card on the nightstand, picked it up. Dr. Shin's contact details, written in clean, unhurried script. He set it back down. "I don't know who Baek-ju-won is. But you do. And whatever he wants with me, you also know that. Or you're close to knowing." Seung-jae was quiet for a long moment. "Rest," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." "That's not a denial." "No," Seung-jae said. "It isn't." He moved toward the door. Ha-joon watched him go. The same unhurried, deliberate walk. The same quality of a man who had already decided the outcome of every room he entered. Seung-jae SSI. The name came out before Ha-joon had fully decided to say it. Seung-jae stopped at the door. "Thank you," Ha-joon said, "for coming downstairs." Seung-jae stood with his hand on the doorframe. Something moved in the set of his shoulders, not quite a response. More like the acknowledgement of one. Then he turned off the light and pulled the door quietly closed, and Ha-joon lay in the cedar-scented dark of a room that felt, improbably, like somewhere he could breathe. Ha-joon woke to light. Not the aggressive kind. Not the light of a room that had forgotten to consider the person sleeping in it. This light arrived through a narrow gap in the curtains, a single deliberate line crossing the pale concrete floor, stopping precisely short of the bed, as though it had been instructed to. Ha-joon lay and watched it for a moment, measuring the angle, placing the time somewhere between 7 and 8 in the morning. The headache had downgraded overnight. Still present, but distant now, a reminder rather than a fact. He found the bathroom through the first door on the left. White stone, underfloor heating, a folded towel on the vanity edge with a sealed toothbrush set beside it. Prepared, not assumed. The difference between a guest room and a holding room, and Ha-joon noticed it in the same way he noticed the ceiling last night. Someone had thought about his comfort and executed it without announcement. He dressed in yesterday's clothes, which had been cleaned and folded on the chair near the door, and followed the smell of coffee. The penthouse opened into a main living space that made him stop in the hallway for 3 full seconds. It was serious architecture. Clean structural lines, double-height windows running the full length of the northern wall, a kitchen that was recessed and considered rather than displayed. The furniture was sparse, a long sofa in charcoal linen, a low table in the same dark walnut as the nightstand, 2 chairs positioned near the window as if conversation were a thing that happened there occasionally and without ceremony. No decoration for its own sake. Every object present because it had earned the right to be there. Ha-joon looked at it the way he looked at all considered spaces, with something close to recognition. Seung-jae was in the kitchen. He had his back to the room, pressing the filter on a pour-over setup with the focused, economical attention of someone for whom making coffee was not a performance but a practice. He was in a different shirt today, dark navy, clean, sleeves already rolled. He didn't turn around, but something in the set of his shoulders said he'd heard Ha-joon enter. "Sit," he said. "Or stand. The view is better from the window." Ha-joon went to the window. Seoul spread below in its full morning complexity, layered, dense, the particular organized chaos of a city that had rebuilt itself several times and remembered all the versions. He found the restaurant district by instinct, traced the street sable and silk was on without meaning to. Some part of his brain was always mapping. The coffee arrived at his elbow without ceremony. He turned to find Seung-jae standing beside him, holding out a second cup, already looking back at the city. Ha-joon took it, drank. It was very good, precise, low acidity, the kind of coffee that had been calibrated rather than just made. He wasn't surprised. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck moved along the street below. A small thing, the ordinary morning carrying on. Flunitrazepam, Seung-jae said. High concentration variant. It's not something you find easily. Whoever supplied Kwon Tae-min had access to a specific network, medical or otherwise. Ha-joon turned the name over. He'd heard Dr. Shin say it last night, but hadn't fully filed it. Now he did, slotting it into its proper place, the way he slotted a structural discrepancy into a floor plan. A fact with implications. How long would it have taken, he asked, to fully incapacitate you? Another 4 minutes. Possibly 3. Seung-jae's voice carried no drama. Just accuracy. You held on longer than most would have. I had motivation. Ha-joon drank his coffee. Tae-min was hired. You confirmed that in the restaurant. Yes. By Baek Ju-won. Yes. Ha-joon nodded once. He looked at the city rather than at Seung-jae, giving the information room to settle. And you know why. Or you're close to it. You said we'd talk this morning. Seung-jae was quiet for a beat. I know part of it. GISO is completing the picture. Tell me the part you know. Seung-jae turned from the window and moved back toward the kitchen. He refilled his cup, leaned against the counter edge, not sitting, the posture of someone who thought better on their feet, and looked at Ha-joon across the open space between them. Kwon Tae-min has done 4 confirmed extractions in the past 2 years. All of them for the same contractor. All of the targets were civilians, no faction affiliation, no criminal record. All of them had, in some professional capacity, intersected with one of Baek Ju-won's operations. He paused. None of them were found afterward. The words landed cleanly. Ha-joon received them without flinching, which Seung-jae noted with the same quality of attention he gave everything. You're telling me I was going to disappear, Ha-joon said. Yes. And you're telling me it's connected to my work. That's the part GSO is completing. Seung-jae held his gaze. I need your commission records from the past 18 months. Specifically any work you did for a property group or development company. Anything where the client was indirect. A shell, a representative, a third party. Ha-joon was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee down on the low table and stood very still in the northern light, and Seung-jae watched him think. Watched the precise, architectural mind move through its inventory, pulling files, cross-referencing, running the same calculation a structural engineer runs when a load-bearing wall turns out to be in the wrong place. There was one, Ha-joon said slowly. 8 months ago. A mixed-use development in Mapo. The client was a property group, Trident Holdings. I never met the actual owner. Everything went through a legal representative. He paused. The brief was unusual. They wanted extremely detailed interior documentation. Every room, every partition, every service corridor. Most clients want the aesthetic record. They wanted the structural one. Did anything about the building seem irregular to you? The pause this time was longer. Ha-joon picked up his coffee again, and Seung-jae recognized the gesture for what it was. Not avoidance, but the habit of a precise person buying a single moment before committing to a statement. There was a room, Ha-joon said carefully, that I documented in my personal archive that wasn't in the submitted plans. He looked at Seung-jae directly. At the time, I assumed it was an administrative error on my end. A misfiled reference scan. He stopped. It wasn't an error, was it? Seung-jae said nothing, which was itself an answer. Ha-joon set his cup down again with the same deliberate precision he did everything. He looked at the floor for a moment, the polished concrete, honest and structural, the same language as the ceiling in the bedroom. Then he looked up. Here's what I don't understand, he said. I submitted the plans 8 months ago. If I was a liability then, why wait until now? What changed? The question arrived in the room and stayed there. Seung-jae looked at him, and Ha-joon watched the same infinitesimal shift he'd seen last night cross the alpha's face. Not surprise. Something more considered than surprise. The expression of a man recalibrating, finding that the thing in front of him required a slightly different kind of attention than he'd prepared for. That, Seung-jae said quietly, is exactly the right question. Do you have the answer? GISO will be here in an hour. Ha-joon nodded slowly. He retrieved his coffee, turned back to the window, and looked at the city with the focused stillness of a man preparing to find a room that shouldn't exist inside his own memory. Seung-jae watched him and said nothing. Outside, Seoul continued its mourning, indifferent and intricate, carrying its secrets the way cities always did. In the walls, in the spaces between things, in the rooms that didn't appear on any submitted plan. Nam Jae-seo arrived at 9:43 with a black folder, 2 staff from the building's lower office, and the quiet, load-bearing efficiency of a man who had spent the night working and didn't need anyone to acknowledge it. He set the folder on the low walnut table without preamble, dismissed the staff with a look, and accepted the coffee Seung-jae held out to him with the brief, functional gratitude of someone for whom small courtesies registered but didn't slow things down. Ha-joon was already seated on the charcoal sofa, both hands around his second cup, watching Jae-seo the way he'd been watching everything since he woke up, quietly, completely missing nothing. Jae-seo looked at him. "How are you feeling?" "Functional," Ha-joon said. Jae-seo accepted this and opened the folder. "I'll go through this in order. Stop me if something is inaccurate or if you need context." He looked at Ha-joon directly. "This is your professional record for the past 2 years. I want you to understand that the information was gathered to help you, not to be held over you." "I understand," Ha-joon said. Seung-jae stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee, slightly removed from the table, present but not presiding, giving the conversation its own space. Jae-seo began. The first pages were straightforward. Ha-joon's commission history laid out in clean chronological order. Residential interiors, 2 commercial gallery spaces, a boutique hotel lobby in Itaewon that Ha-joon remembered fondly for its structural complexity. Standard work. Documented clients, clean payment trails, nothing that required explanation. Ha-joon scanned each page without comment, confirming with small nods that the record was accurate. Then Jae-seo turned to a tabbed section near the middle of the folder and slid it across the table. "Trident Property Holdings," he said. "Registered in the Cayman Islands. Operational address listed as a legal services firm in Uedo. The firm is a known intermediary. It has appeared in the commission trails of 4 other contractors over the past 3 years, all of them working on properties in the Mapo and Yeongdeungpo districts." He paused. "Every property connected to Trident has subsequently been identified as an operational site for Baek Ju-won's logistics network." Ha-joon looked at the page. The Trident Holdings letterhead, his own project reference number printed neatly below it. His handwriting in the margin, a note to himself about ceiling clearance on the 3rd floor. He remembered writing it. He remembered thinking it was a straightforward commission. "The mixed-use development in Mapo," Jae-seo continued, turning to the next tab. "Officially registered as a commercial and residential complex. Permitted use. Retail ground floor, office floors 2 through 4, residential floors 5 through 8. He set a building schematic on the table. Not Ha-joon's version, a different one. The registered version. "This is what was submitted to the City Planning Authority." Then he set a second schematic beside it. Ha-joon went still. It was his documentation. His line weights, his notation style, his reference codes in the margins. The personal archive version, the one he kept for his own records, the one that was more complete than what clients typically requested. "This is mine," he said. "Yes. We recovered it from a server associated with Trident Holdings' legal representative. They obtained a copy without your knowledge, approximately 6 months after you submitted your final commission deliverables." Ha-joon looked at the 2 schematics side by side, the registered version and his own. He found the discrepancy in under 10 seconds, because he had drawn both and he knew every line of his own work. The subbasement level. On the registered schematic, a mechanical services room, standard dimensions, nothing unusual. On his personal documentation, a different room entirely. Larger. Reinforced. A separate ventilation line running parallel to the main building system, accessed by a corridor that the registered plans had redrawn as a solid wall. "I documented that room during the structural survey phase," Ha-joon said slowly. "It was already built when I arrived on site. I assumed it was a legacy space from the original building. The development was a partial renovation. I noted it because I note everything." He looked at Jae-seo. "I flagged it to the legal representative. He told me it was a decommissioned utilities space and that it wouldn't be included in the final brief." "He lied," Jae-seo said without inflection. "That room is a subterranean transfer vault. Climate-controlled, independently powered, with a vehicle access corridor running beneath the south foundation wall. It is the primary holding and transit point for Baek Ju-won's import network, specifically for pharmaceutical compounds moving through the Mapo distribution chain." He turned one more page. Your documentation of that room is the most complete architectural record of that vault in existence. The measurements, the ventilation system, the access points, the load-bearing specifications of the walls. He looked at Ha-joon steadily. You drew a blueprint of his most protected operational asset and kept a copy of it. The room was quiet. Ha-joon looked at his own handwriting in the margin of the schematic. Ceiling clearance, for 0.2 m. Rebar density, non-standard. Independent HVAC line, verify origin point. He had verified the origin point. He had noted it in a separate reference file. He had been thorough because he was always thorough and because thoroughness was the entire point of his work. He didn't know I had the personal archive copy, Ha-joon said. When I submitted the commission deliverables, I removed the sub-basement documentation from the client package. Standard practice for anything I flag as potentially irregular. I keep it separately until the client confirms what they want included. He looked at Choi Seung-jae. So for 6 months he thought the documentation was contained. Yes, until Trident's representative found the server copy. How? Your cloud backup service was compromised. A low-level intrusion, the kind that takes months to execute quietly. They found the file 4 weeks ago. Choi Seung-jae closed the folder with the precision of someone who had delivered all the necessary facts and knew it. That is what changed. That is why Tae-min was hired now rather than 8 months ago. Ha-joon sat with this. The logic of it assembling itself cleanly in front of him, each piece finding its place, the commission, the room, the archive copy, the 4-week timeline. An architectural problem with a very clean causal chain. He looked at Seung-jae. Seung-jae was watching him from the kitchen counter with that same quality of attention, steady, undemanding, giving him the space to arrive at his own conclusions at his own pace. He found the file 4 weeks ago, Ha-joon said. Which means he knows I have it. And he knows I've seen that room. Which means even if the server copy was deleted, you're still the liability, Seung-jae said. Because you drew it. Because it's in here. He looked at Ha-joon directly, and for the first time something in his voice carried an edge that wasn't quite clinical. Something lower, with more weight in it. You remember everything you document, don't you? It wasn't really a question. Ha-joon looked at the schematic on the table. His own lines, his own notations, the precise and faithful record of a room that was never supposed to exist in anyone's documentation. Every measurement, he said quietly. Every wall. Choi Seung-jae picked up his coffee. The city moved outside the window, indifferent as always. On the table between them, Ha-joon's own handwriting looked back at him. Meticulous, thorough, and as it turned out, the most dangerous thing about him. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers and tell me where you're watching from. Choi Seung-jae left the folder. He didn't make a ceremony of it, simply stood, buttoned his jacket, and told Seung-jae he'd have the secondary analysis ready by early afternoon. He acknowledged Ha-joon with a brief, respectful nod that carried something Ha-joon hadn't expected. Not pity. Something closer to recognition, one precise person acknowledging another. Then he was gone, and the penthouse returned to its considered quiet. Ha-joon sat with the folder open on the table in front of him and didn't touch it for a full minute. He was aware of Seung-jae moving in the kitchen behind him. The quiet sounds of a second round of coffee being prepared, unhurried, giving him the silence without making a point of giving it. I need my laptop, Ha-joon said. Choi Seung-jae had it brought up this morning. It's on the desk in the study. A pause. Second door on the left. Ha-joon found it exactly where Seung-jae said, his own laptop, closed, centered on a desk that was otherwise bare. Someone had charged it overnight. The cable was still connected, neatly routed along the desk edge. He stood and looked at that small, considered detail for a moment, then sat down, opened the machine, and went to work. His personal archive was organized the way his mind was organized, hierarchical, obsessively indexed, every project folder carrying the same internal structure regardless of scale. Client brief. Site survey. Reference documentation. Personal notation files. He navigated it without thinking, the way a person navigates their own home in the dark. He found the Trident Holdings folder and opened it. The client deliverable package was there. The version he had submitted, cleaned and finalized, the sub-basement documentation removed as he'd described. He opened it first, not because he needed to confirm what was in it, but because he needed to hold the baseline clearly before he looked at anything else. Then he opened his personal archive subfolder. The full site survey. Every floor, every elevation, Every service corridor documented in the obsessive, methodical way that was simply how he worked. Not because anyone asked him to be that thorough, but because incompleteness felt, to him, like a kind of dishonesty. He opened the subbasement file. It was there. His own scan, his own notation layer, his own measurements annotating a room that the registered building plans described as a standard mechanical services space, and that his survey had found to be something else entirely. He had noted the discrepancy at the time in his reference log. A single line. Dimensions inconsistent with registered permit. Client rep advised decommission space, exclude from final brief. Retained for personal record per standard practice. Standard practice. He had written it off as an administrative irregularity and filed it and moved on to the next commission. The way a careful professional moves on when a client says don't worry about it and the job is otherwise complete. He pulled up the registered schematic side by side with his personal survey on a split screen. And then he saw it. Not the subbasement discrepancy. He already knew about that. Something else. Something smaller, quieter. The kind of thing you would only find if you were looking at both versions with the specific intention of finding what didn't match. The ventilation notation on the third floor. In his personal archive, he had documented the HVAC configuration on the third floor with a reference cross-link to the subbasement. Noting that the independent ventilation line he'd found below appeared to route upward through a service shaft on the building's south wall, exiting through a third-floor mechanical room that the client brief had described as inactive storage. In the client deliverable, the version he had submitted and signed off on, that cross-link notation was gone. Not removed by him. He was certain of that with the totality of a person who knew their own work the way musicians knew their own handwriting. He had not removed it. The notation style was slightly wrong. The same typeface, the same formatting, but the reference code used a dash where he always used a dot. A single character. The kind of thing you would never see unless you had written the original yourself and your hands remembered the difference. Someone had accessed his submitted documentation after delivery and modified it. Ha-joon sat back in the chair. He understood, with the cold clarity of a structural calculation resolving itself, what this meant. His submission hadn't just been used, it had been edited. Someone inside Trident Holdings, or working for them, had gone into the delivered package and removed the one notation that created a documentary connection between the third floor and the subbasement vault. They had cleaned the evidence trail. Carefully, almost perfectly. Almost. Seung-jae SSI. Seung-jae appeared in the doorway within a few seconds, not rushing, but present, as though he'd been nearby without making it obvious. "Come and look at this," Ha-joon said. Seung-jae crossed the room and stood beside the desk, looking at the split screen. Ha-joon walked him through it, the two versions, the missing cross-link, the reference code with the wrong character. He was precise and brief, the way he was precise and brief when presenting to clients, stripping the explanation down to its structural elements. Seung-jae looked at the screen for a long moment. "You're certain the modification isn't yours?" "I use a dot. Always. It's not a style choice. It's a notation system I've used since university. Every reference code in every file I've ever produced uses a dot." Ha-joon pointed to the screen. "That's a dash. Someone edited my submitted file and didn't know about the dot. When could they have accessed it? After delivery. I submitted via encrypted transfer to the legal representative's designated server. After that, the file was theirs." He paused. "Which means they edited it, and then 6 months later they found my personal archive copy and realized the original notation was still there. The version they couldn't reach and couldn't clean." He looked at Seung-jae. "The cross-link notation in my archive connects the ventilation shaft directly to the vault. It's not just a record of the room's dimensions. It's a map of how the vault breathes, the intake points, the exhaust routing, the service access intervals." He stopped. Seung-jae was looking at him with an expression Ha-joon was beginning to learn. That particular quality of stillness that meant he was processing something and had decided not to speak until he'd finished. "That notation," Seung-jae said carefully. "In the wrong hands, or the right ones, that's an entry blueprint." "Yes," Ha-joon said. "If you wanted to access that vault without triggering the independent ventilation alarm, that cross-link tells you exactly how." He sat back. "I didn't know I'd documented that. I documented it because it was there and I document what's there. I didn't know what the room was." "I know, but I've been carrying it for 8 months." He looked at the screen, his own notation, his own dot, the small faithful mark of a thorough person who noticed things and wrote them down. Every measurement, Every wall. He repeated his own words from earlier, quietly, but they meant something different now. I've been carrying a key to his vault, and I didn't know it existed. The room held that for a moment. Then Seung-jae straightened and pulled out his phone. I need to call Jae-seo. Tell him about the ventilation crosslink, Ha-joon said. And tell him to check whether the legal representative server access logs show who made the modification and when. There will be a timestamp. Whoever edited that file left a timestamp. Seung-jae paused in the doorway and looked back at him. You're already 3 steps ahead, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Ha-joon looked at his own handwriting on the screen. The dot, the dash, the 1-character distance between his version and theirs. I designed the room, he said simply. I know where everything is. Jae-seo returned at 2 in the afternoon with a second folder, thinner than the first, and the particular quality of composure that meant the contents required it. Ha-joon had spent the intervening hours at the study desk, working through his archive with the focused, methodical attention of someone who had decided that understanding his own situation completely was the only form of control available to him. He had cross-referenced every Trident-adjacent notation in his files, built a separate document cataloging every discrepancy between his personal records and the submitted deliverables, and identified 2 additional modifications he hadn't caught in the first pass, both minor, both consistent with the same editorial hand, both carrying the dash instead of his dot. He brought the document to the table when Jae-seo arrived. Jae-seo looked at it, looked at Ha-joon, and set it beside his own folder without comment. The acknowledgement of one thorough person receiving the work of another. Seung-jae took his usual position, standing slightly removed, coffee in hand. The geometry of the 3 of them had established itself naturally over the course of the morning. Jae-seo presenting, Ha-joon receiving, Seung-jae holding the perimeter of the conversation with his particular quality of present stillness. The timestamp, Ha-joon said. Confirmed, Jae-seo said. The modification was made 19 days after your delivery. The server access log shows an internal edit by a credentialed user, the legal representative's own login. He didn't outsource it. He did it himself, which means he reviewed your documentation personally and found the cross-link notation. He opened his folder. He spent 11 minutes in the file, removed 1 notation, then closed it and didn't access it again. He thought he'd contained it, Ha-joon said. Yes, until the archive copy surfaced 4 weeks ago. Jae-seo turned a page. We also confirmed the identity of Trident Holdings' operating principal. The shell has 3 layers, but the terminal ownership traces to a holding company registered under a nominee director in Jeju. The nominee is a known associate of Baek Ju-won's legal infrastructure. He looked up. There is no ambiguity. The Mapo building is his. The vault is his. And your documentation is the only external record of its precise configuration. Ha-joon nodded once. He'd already arrived at this conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by Jiseo's evidence trail had a different weight. The weight of a thing becoming official, moving from calculation to fact. There's a second matter, Jae-seo said. His voice shifted. Not dramatically, but Ha-joon had been listening to it all morning, and he caught the adjustment. A careful recalibration, the tone of someone about to place something delicate on the table. This one is more complex. He turned to a new section of the folder and set a single document in the center of the table. It was formatted differently from the rest, cleaner, more formal, the typography of an official instrument rather than an investigative report. Ha-joon read the header, Interfaction Neutral Ground Doctrine, Revised Protocol, Article 7. The Alpha Council, Jae-seo said, governs conduct between the recognized faction leaders in Seoul and the surrounding metropolitan territories. The council has 9 seats. Seung-jae holds 1. Baek Ju-won holds another. He paused. The neutral ground doctrine was established 4 years ago following a territorial dispute that cost both factions significant losses. It exists to prevent direct conflict between recognized alphas by establishing binding protocols for the resolution of cross-faction incidents. Ha-joon looked at the document. Then he looked at Seung-jae. Seung-jae was looking at the window. Article 7, Jae-seo continued, addresses civilian entanglement. Specifically, if a civilian becomes materially involved in a dispute between 2 faction territories and one faction leader takes protective custody of that civilian, the opposing faction leader has the right to petition the council for the civilian's transfer. He let that sit for a moment. The petition requires a majority council vote. If the vote passes, the faction leader holding the civilian is bound by the doctrine to release them to neutral council custody, after which the petitioning faction leader may make a claim. The room was very quiet. Neutral council custody, Ha-joon said carefully. What does that mean in practice? Jaeho's pause was brief but present. In practice, it means a holding period of 72 hours during which the council nominally reviews the claim. In practice, it means access. Baek Ju-won's council relationships are established. The review period has historically functioned as a transfer mechanism rather than a genuine deliberation. Ha-joon absorbed this with the stillness of a person doing rapid structural calculations. So the doctrine that's supposed to protect civilians is, in this specific application, the mechanism by which I would be handed to the person who tried to have me disappeared. That is an accurate summary, Jae-seo said. Has Baek Ju-won filed the petition? Not yet. He filed a preliminary notice of intent this morning, which is a procedural step required before a formal petition. It gives the holding party 24 hours to respond before the petition activates. Jae-seo closed the folder. The notice was filed at 9:15. The response window closes at 9:15 tomorrow morning. Ha-joon turned to look at Seung-jae directly. Seung-jae had turned from the window during Jae-seo's explanation. He was looking at Ha-joon now with that steady, undemanding attention, but something underneath it had changed. The stillness had a different quality. Denser. The stillness of a decision already made that hadn't been spoken yet. The other faction leaders, Ha-joon said. They're watching. All 8 remaining seats, Jae-seo confirmed. A pact leader breaking the neutral ground doctrine without council authorization would be unprecedented. It would be read as a declaration of unilateral authority. Several seats would see it as destabilizing. He paused. Several seats would also quietly respect it. The council's relationship with Baek Ju-won is functional, but not warm. He holds his position through leverage rather than loyalty. Another pause. That distinction matters, but it doesn't change the formal calculus. Legally, within the doctrine's framework, compliance is the required move. Compliance, Ha-joon repeated. The word sat in his mouth with a specific texture. Yes. Ha-joon looked at the Article 7 document on the table. He looked at the formal, clean typography of a protocol designed to prevent war and currently functioning as a delivery mechanism. He thought about the room in the Mapo building. He thought about Taemin's practiced smile and the 4 people who had been extracted before him and not found afterward. He thought about the dot and the dash, the 1-character distance between his record and their erasure of it. Then he looked at Seung-jae and asked the question quietly, without drama, the way he asked all his precise questions. What are you going to do? Seung-jae held his gaze. The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Not evasion, but wait. The wait of a man standing at the edge of something and looking at it clearly before he stepped. Jae-seo, he said, without breaking eye contact with Ha-joon. Draft the response to the preliminary notice. What should it say? Seung-jae finally looked away from Ha-joon, toward the window, toward the city, toward whatever version of the next 24 hours he was already building in the architecture of his mind. Tell them we received it, he said. Tell them we're reviewing the doctrine's applicability. A pause. And tell them we'll need the full 24 hours. Jae-seo made a note. Ha-joon looked at Seung-jae's profile against the window, the clean, deliberate lines of a face that had already decided and was simply not yet ready to say it out loud. Outside, Seoul held its breath. The clock had started. The council's envoy arrived at 8:45 the following morning. Ha-joon heard him from the study. The elevator, the brief exchange with whoever Seung-jae had stationed in the entry, then footsteps crossing the main living space with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who had done this before and understood that pace communicated authority. He should have stayed in the study. He knew that. Instead, he found himself in the hallway, standing just beyond the point where the corridor opened into the living room, close enough to hear everything and far enough that no one had technically told him to leave. The envoy was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, dressed in the kind of understated suit that announced serious money without itemizing it. He carried a slim document case and the specific composure of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts. He stood in the center of the living room and didn't take the seat Jae-seo had indicated, which was itself a message. Seung-jae stood opposite him. No jacket, sleeves rolled, coffee absent for once. The posture of someone who had decided this meeting didn't require the performance of hospitality. The council has reviewed Baek Ju-won's preliminary notice, the envoy said. His voice was measured, professionally neutral, the voice of an instrument rather than a person. The consensus is that Article 7 applies without ambiguity. The civilian in question entered your custody directly from a neutrality zone incident on your registered premises. The doctrine's provisions are clear. He set the document case on the low table. The formal petition activates in 32 minutes. The council is requesting your compliance position before that activation, as a matter of procedural courtesy. He opened the document case and placed a single sheet on the table, clean, formal, a signature line at the bottom. This is a voluntary transfer acknowledgement. It confirms that the civilian will be released to council custody by noon today, avoiding the need for a formal vote. He looked at Seung-jae with the careful neutrality of a man who was neither sympathetic nor hostile, simply present. The council considers this the most stable resolution available. Seung-jae looked at the document on the table. He didn't pick it up. The silence ran for 10 full seconds. Ha-joon counted them, standing in the hallway with his shoulder against the wall, not breathing in any meaningful way. No, Seung-jae said. One word. Quiet, final, carrying no more weight than it needed to because it didn't need any more than it already had. The envoy looked at him. Something moved in his composed expression. Not surprise, Ha-joon thought. Something more like confirmation. As though he had presented this document knowing what the answer would be, and had come anyway, because protocol required the attempt. You understand what this means, the envoy said. Yes. The petition will activate. The vote will proceed. If the majority holds. Let it hold, Seung-jae said. My position won't change. A pause. The envoy looked at Jae-seo, who returned the look with the pleasant, impenetrable expression of a man who had nothing to add. Then the envoy picked up the unsigned document, returned it to his case, and closed it with a soft, definitive click. The council will note your position, he said. Note it clearly, Seung-jae said. The envoy left. The elevator opened and closed. The penthouse returned to its quiet, and in that quiet Ha-joon became aware that he had been holding tension in his hands. Both of them pressed flat against the hallway wall behind him, the plaster cool and real under his palms. He stayed there for a moment. Then he walked to the kitchen. He found the electric kettle on the second shelf he checked, the tea in a drawer beside the stove, a small selection, organized by type, the chamomile at the front. He filled the kettle and switched it on and found 2 cups in the cabinet above the counter, setting them on the surface with the careful, deliberate movement of a person who needed to do something with their hands and had chosen something useful. He didn't think about the vote. He didn't think about Baek Ju-won or the vault or the document with the empty signature line. He thought about water temperature and steep time and whether chamomile required a strainer, which it did, and whether this kitchen had one, which it did, hanging on a small hook inside the cabinet door with the quiet, considered logic of a space designed by someone who thought about where things should be. He heard Seung-jae enter the kitchen behind him. He didn't turn around. He poured the water, just off the boil, correct, and set the strainer over the first cup and began. Seung-jae didn't speak. He came to stand beside the counter, not close enough to crowd the space, and Ha-joon was aware of him the way you were aware of a load-bearing wall. Structurally, completely, without needing to look directly at it to know it was there. The tea steeped. The kitchen held them both in its honest, functional quiet. Ha-joon set the second cup in front of the space where Seung-jae was standing. Seung-jae looked at it, then at Ha-joon's profile, then picked it up. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said in a single word in the living room, and Ha-joon standing in this kitchen making tea instead of asking Jae-seo to call him a car was its own kind of answer to its own kind of question. Seung-jae's phone vibrated on the counter. He looked at it, set down his tea. His expression didn't change, but something in his stillness did. A density entering it, the particular quality of a man receiving information he had already prepared for. He turned the phone so Ha-joon could see the screen. A message. No sender name, just a number and 4 words. The clock has started. Ha-joon looked at it. Then he looked at Seung-jae. Okay, he said quietly. Seung-jae picked up his tea. Outside the kitchen window, Seoul continued its mourning, indifferent, intricate, carrying its wars inside its walls the way it always had. The clock had started, and neither of them looked away.